we tend to, even the idea of compromise in a political sense is the wrong approach with something like COVID. We should have been much more aggressive earlier on so that our total level of compromise with respect to civil liberties could have been much less. In other words, if early on we had engaged in a really intense 6-week lockdown and we had ramped up our capacity to test for COVID with precision, so that after 6 weeks, basically the idea of 6 weeks would be, it's very hard to control COVID inside of a household. It tends to bounce around, but that it will tend to burn itself out in most households within something like a 6-week period. That if we had engaged in that and then used track and trace to find and control outbreaks following such an intense lockdown, we might not have had to deal with a full year of the half-assed measure. And the sense that I have is that we're getting, maybe it's a Pareto distribution. Maybe we're suffering 80% of the harm of lockdowns and getting 20% of the value that we might get for having, not gone the full distance. And unfortunately, I think the prerequisite to our behaving rationally is having our experts completely liberated from market forces, from political dynamics, and free to tell us what it is that we need to know, and then getting on the same page and having a proper rubric for evaluating what has worked and what hasn't. And instead, what we've had is a thoroughly politicized discussion from the get-go, in which even our countermeasures are fought over on the basis of, why is it that a Trump voter is much more likely to be a mask skeptic? A question of masks is an empirical question. It shouldn't have anything to do with your political leanings, and yet it undeniably does in North America, and that has robbed us of the kinds of controls that we might otherwise have instituted.
I wanted to ask you, you talked, I want to bring the discussion, if you don't mind, back to something that we were touching on earlier, that your initial objection when you were at Evergreen to whatever it was that was developing in the background. And now we've had 4 years to see whatever it is manifesting itself. And so what is it? What is it that's happening, do you think, in our politicized landscape?
Well, I have a guess, and it's right up your alley. It's something I'm intending to explore at greater length, but the basics are this, I suspect. You and I think, would share the opinion that psychological development is among the most important phenomena for understanding human beings, and it is underrated. We tend to look at the behavior of adults and study it, but we should spend more time thinking about how those adults ended up the way they did in order to really understand them. And I think for each generation, you have a developmental landscape, and what the governing forces are in that developmental landscape has a lot to say about both the insights and the blind spots of the people who emerge from it. And so I would say that for Americans of my generation, I'm a Gen X, the market played too much of a role developmentally, and it has created a kind of lens through which we can't help but look. It has, commodified things in a way that is quite unhealthy.
You were born when?
I was born in 1969.
Okay.
For millennials, and maybe even more so for Gen Z, I suspect that there is a pivot to something else. And many people, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have certainly talked about iGen, the internet generation. But what I suspect is really going on is that if you are sufficiently plugged into the internet early enough, there comes a point at which the your persona on the internet takes primacy. It is more important than your actual physical life persona.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. I would say, from personal experience, there's more of me on the internet than there is in me. My electronic avatars are far more powerful than me. Personally, you know, and right. I can watch this because I've been away for a year and a half, and yet my internet presence has steadily increased during that time. And I look online now and it's 700 million views, something like that.
So now imagine that as the developmental environment for children. Now, here's the connection I want to draw. My contention is that the online landscape is postmodern, right? That if we were just to simply describe it, the rules, the physics of online life are postmodern.
Because it's abstracted from the environment.
Right. So, for example,
it's like living in a dictionary.
If I decided tomorrow that I was a woman, right? I could change my internet presence such that I would present in a female way. I could say, hey, anybody who doesn't treat me as female is a jerk. And the point is, I have transitioned completely, right? Now, obviously, there's no such thing in the physical world. You can transition, you can take hormones or blockers, you can get surgeries, but no man has ever become a woman and reproduced in a female way, right? So the point is, the physical world has all kinds of constraints that come from physics and biology, which do not translate to the online world. And for people like you and me, for whom the online world is an add-on world, we think, well, obviously real life is the important one. And then the online thing has some interface with it, which is frightening, but we understand how they relate. But if you reverse these two things, then what you get is a generation that its problem-solving mind says, actually, of course you can transition. You can transition, and then it is everybody's obligation to live by who you've told us you are, and anybody who doesn't is a bad person. And what has to be true for that to be the case, right?
You know, I had a fantasy a long while ago that people would end up wearing glasses, like the Google glasses, that would be illegal to take off.